Hello, everyone. We're here to talk about how do we grow successful agile transformations when people are working from home. And I can tell you that I'm a fan of Patrick Lencioni. He wrote a book called The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. And, do you have trust in your team? Is there a fear of healthy conflict? Do we hold each other to account? And, how much are we kind of holding ourselves accountable as well in terms of results? Do we care just about our own results? Or do we care about the results of the entire organization? For those of you who are interested in the five dysfunctions of a team, Patrick Lencioni also had a podcast. He had an episode, and one of them in particular was about the five dysfunctions of a virtual team, which I found really, really interesting. And in that episode, he talked about people doing Zoom calls. So when you go on to a Zoom call, a lot of people kind of treat it like some real like professional meeting, and we don't have like those kind of water cooler type conversations and so on. And so basically, what he recommends to us is that, when you're on these meetings, you don't have to be so professional as you normally are. Now, we're not saying don't be a professional, but be human. Um, if your daughter, your dog, your cat wants to come into the room, a lot of us are stuck at home anyway, so let them come in. I've had lots of training sessions with my daughter in my lap, with the dog barking downstairs, and it's just normal. We're all kind of getting used to that. And more importantly, when we're finished having our kind of meeting, we just check in, how things going at home, and how's your brother, how's your sister, what happened with your sports and all that kind of thing, and what's going on at the weekend and so on. And so we need to be careful not to forget about that. And so that's probably one of the things that we might touch on later on. But I'm really delighted to have three wonderful guests today from the world of agile HR and agility in general. And I'm going to introduce each of the people just briefly by name, and I'm going to ask them to kind of introduce themselves. And so starting with myself, I'm John Coleman. I'm an agility chef. The metaphor is a lot of the time, we think we want to do this, that, and the other. We open the fridge, there's not much in the fridge. So we make do with what we've got and try to make some nice agility with what's available in the organization. We've also have David Nixon here as well. David, would you like to introduce yourself? You're on mute, David. We don't hear you.
Yeah, sorry about that. Hi, my name is David Nixon. Thank you, John. I'm a writer and performer, but I now have a vested interest in the application of narrative patterning and narrative theory, especially in the agile sphere.
Thank you, David. Delighted to have you here on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Kyle, would you mind introducing yourself as well, please? Kyle Richardson.
Yeah, my name's Kyle. I'm very different again. I'm a software development manager. So I head up a small software development team. It's an agile team broken into several smaller teams. And I'm just excited to be part of Carolyn's journey.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Last but not least, Carolyn Mumby. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you very much, John. I'm certainly, my finger is hovering over the mute button in case my dog starts barking or whatever happens in my house. So I feel much more relaxed now that I don't need to worry about that. It's a nice introduction. Yes, I'm CEO of Elidex, and I'm currently project lead on an Innovate UK grants project called Shine. And we are developing a system to provide agile metrics for feedback loops to help guide performance management of teams and self-improvement. We also have lots of other software interests all around HR, and I'm personally qualified in law and also as an agile HR coach and OKR coach too.
Oh, that's really cool. And I was delighted to get to know you recently, Carolyn, because I've been kind of worried about, how people get promoted and all that kind of stuff in this agile world, but we might leave that to later in the discussion or maybe another time. But this topic today, how do we roll out successful agile transformations when people are working from home? What's your experience been so far, Carolyn?
Well, I think that it's a huge subject, and it can really disrupt. It's very disruptive to an organization, especially during a time when paradigm shifts are everywhere you look. They've got enough going on without also being told that they're about to be part of a change management program. It's quite frightening, quite scary. So on the one hand, you could go diving into the detail and you could start saying, okay, let's look at well-being. No doubt you will end up there one way or another because it's absolutely fundamental, as is trust, which is a point you've just made earlier. But at some point, you're going to need to face the fact that these things start at the top, and you have to have strategic alignment. You have to have alignment across your entire organization to make it happen. And the last thing really I think everybody needs right now is a change management program that's doomed to failure from the start, because we've got quite enough to juggle. So if you're going to attempt and pull off a successful agile transformation, then you're going to need to make sure that you've got alignment across your critical linkages, as Professor John Trevor calls it at Saïd Business School.
Can you tell us a little bit more about those? What are those linkages, Carolyn?
Well, yes, they are business strategy. I'm reading them here because I don't get them wrong, because I've already quoted John Trevor. Business strategy, organizational capability, management systems, and organizational architecture. Now, he points out that you're only as strong as your weakest link. And that's really fascinating to me, because now I can dive into the organizational architecture part, which is people, policies, and culture. And somehow everything starts kind of falling into place for people. If you're in HR, you might be sitting at tables thinking, where do I fit in? Everyone's looking at me to kind of pull this whole thing off, because I've got people and culture on my plate. So how am I going to do that? I mean, you can't do it on your own is the answer. You'll need the support of the entire organization. So the pressure's off a little bit to start with.
So what have you seen, like, in terms of people working from home? Like, I mean, just to kind of give a bit of context. I mean, I've been working remotely since April last year. And I actually started working in the company remotely, and I only met the people in, I think it was July. And I met some more people again in September and October, and then the office shut down and I kind of left. And I managed to meet people in Starbucks and stuff like that before I left the country and finally came back here. But I have noticed that it is more difficult to kind of keep those connections going with people.
Yes.
Back-to-back calls and all that kind of stuff. So, like, in terms of the strategic alignment, how does that all kind of make a difference in terms of what people are doing on the ground? How does that affect in terms of the working from home and so on?
Well, I think that it obviously has a massive effect on people, because we're all experimenting with it, aren't we? I mean, you just described it there, and there are similarities, but it's very personal. You're in a personal space, and you are feeling rather reliant on this Zoom thing or whatever you're using in order to this channel Teams or whatever it might be. And as a result of that, you find yourself cramming all these sort of meetings in. And I don't know if it's just presenteeism to some extent, but people are joining a lot of meetings. And I think you and I were talking the other day about sometimes people are committing to meetings that they don't even go to because they just think, oh, I've just got too much on my plate, I can't cope. So I do have a colleague actually who says he's just said, no, I'm not booking any at all. What I'm doing, booking any meetings, what I'm doing is I'm saying to people, well, I'm here, I'm working all day. And if you need a meeting, you need me to join, let me know and I'll see if I can. I'd like to join. He's very positive about it, but he's not going to do it if he's getting Zoom overload or Teams overload. And I think that's a really good approach. However, not that many of us have that luxury. There are some things that we have to commit to. But I think if you look to your policies and procedures, I think you're in trouble if you just rely on those. You need to be empowering people to find solutions. I believe that more than ever now. They can really help you. Yes, you need your policies and procedures for the structured stuff. That's really important. Everything's a process, but we're creating our own processes in a virtual world. And we're experiencing them. And of course, as fans of empowering teams, we would all think that the best people to ask to solve the problem and to come up with the new ways of working are the teams who are doing it.
Yeah, it's one of the things I've noticed though is the energy that we have. As you mentioned, like people kind of getting zoomed out and so on. And so, how do we keep our energy up? So, like maybe we'll get to that later on, but that's something that I see as a bit of an impediment right now. That we're having these all rituals, and people are turning up to these events and so on, and they're working together and they're collaborating using fantastic tools. But in terms of how we make sure that people have the right energy for the change.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that Kyle's a great one to ask about this, because we were talking the other day, weren't we, Kyle, about energizing and onboarding. I mean, onboarding, there's a problem. You're onboarding people, you've interviewed them, you've never met them, you've interviewed them online, and you're onboarding them online. There might be the other side of the world. Kyle's described the business that he manages, the teams that he manages, but they're global and they're a sizable company. And you've got people working with you in your teams that you've never actually met, haven't you, Kyle? But you've developed a way of dealing with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the sort of things that we've seen, I mean, we were always pretty well set up for it, because all of our teams had people in different time zones in different countries. So becoming more remote wasn't a big problem, but onboarding certainly was to some extent. So what we've done is we've started peppering in things we call happiness events. So really small events which are in the middle of the business day, but they'll be like a pub quiz in the middle of the day. The event this Friday is 2 Truths and a Lie, where senior and non-senior people across the organisation get together and tell 2 truths and a lie about themselves, and people from all across the business can ask them questions to try and call out which one is truth or lie and win points. And so we pepper in things like that. We encourage meditation sessions, mindfulness. We've run some introduction to mindfulness sessions, and just generally trying to look at little micro events that can be spread out throughout people's weeks that help introduce people to other areas of the company, virtually, of course, and other people in the business, but also to raise up those energy levels.
That sounds really cool. And something that happened in the client at the moment as well is they've used a setting in Microsoft Outlook now where, the meeting, if it's a half an hour meeting, they kind of reduce it to 25 minutes. It's like a setting, they set it across the company. And so if you book a meeting for an hour, they kind of reduce it down to 50 minutes. Simple little things like that can help as well, can't they? So I'm really curious, like getting back to Carolyn, to your strategic alignment, right? So when you talked about, it's not just about processes and so on. So where did you actually start, Carolyn? How would you go about in this new world that we're in?
Can I just say that I think, Dave, you're unmuted, and so I'm getting quite a lot of feedback from your microphone. Sorry, could you just repeat that question, John? I couldn't hear it very well.
No problem. So what I'm wondering is, given, that you talked about strategic alignment and, the organizational architecture and all that, where would you start? Because you're saying you probably wouldn't start at certain places, but where would you start? How would you ensure that we're not ensure, but how would you strive to make sure that we're going to have a more successful agility transformation? What would be your starting steps, I guess? Yes.
Well, I think the first thing you've got to do is really it's culture. You're going to try and encourage the culture to support the change and to develop and shape the change in the right direction. That's so important. And I think what Kyle has just said goes right to the heart of that. And as Dave Ulrich was saying in his recent book, that of all the 180 touch points that HR can get involved with, possibly you need to be looking at well-being first, which is a bit of a surprise from someone who you'd think might be going in starting with a different direction. But he's saying well-being is absolutely fundamental. So you might say, we're going to have a change culture. We're going to have an agile culture, because obviously everyone's suddenly going to brand it. Oh, this is agile now. We're going agile. Did you know? And of course, half the organisation don't know what you mean. Why should they? Because they're not fundamentalist about it. They are basically doing their work every day and coping with whatever they're doing. They're listening to the strategy, but they're not necessarily, running in that same direction as everybody else. So you're going to need to create a story, a narrative that's going to bring everyone along with you. But you can't start before you've got the well-being right. And that's really important. So people have to, I know it's fundamental. I know we all know this, but you've got to have the trust. And how can I trust somebody who doesn't really care if I've got too much on my desk and I'm feeling isolated? I don't have any sense of belonging. And I'm, as you've put it already, John, I'm completely I'm zoomed out. How can you start from there? You've got to turn that around, haven't you?
I can really relate to that, Carolyn, because I do a lot of Kanban flow management. Is the work flowing through the system? There's the value being delivered really well at like an organizational level, portfolio level, and a team level. And often I'd want to kind of talk to a team or a team of teams about, why aren't you looking at your workout imaging, and why aren't you kind of keeping an eye on the old shiny balls, and you seem to be chasing new shiny balls and forgetting about the old ones you haven't finished yet. But what I noticed was that I don't know whether it was to do with what we're going through in the pandemic and because of the remote working, or whether it was because of something else. But I kind of intuitively understood that I had to deal with the human factors first. That there's really no point in talking to somebody who's not listening.
Exactly.
It's a waste of energy.
Well, it's Maslow, isn't it? This is your Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's no good offering to send somebody on an agility course if they're freezing cold because there's no heating on. So that's just an easy example. And I know that when it comes to, so assuming then that you're going to address this issue, and you're saying, well, okay, how do we do that? How can we address this on a global scale, perhaps for some organizations? This is a massive undertaking, and you're now in a remote environment. So I've been working with Dave, and some of my colleagues have been working with Dave to do work on narrative, to try to develop a narrative, the skills for developing your own narrative. Of course, we have to remember there's no blueprint, there's no silver bullet. You've got to develop your own to fit your own world that you work in. But Dave's the best person to tell you about this. And I've found this absolutely fascinating. And it's something which just grabs people, and it helps to bring along hearts and minds.
David, I'm really curious about this. And for me, I'm a kind of a guy who needs examples as well. So like, how do you go about this, and what do you do about making sure that there really is a good narrative and that people understand it? You're on mute, David.
It's a good question. First thing you do is turn your microphone on so that you can actually be heard. There are two things that I'm working with Carolyn with. One of them, I have another background in occupational therapy, and from that profession, I bring something called the Coleman model, which is it's a conceptual framework that was developed in Japan in response to a need for a culturally responsive approach to engaging with clients. And the Coleman model essentially uses the metaphor of a river to understand the narrative flow of someone's life. So this is something that we're exploring the use and application of within an agile environment. Carolyn was referring there to other areas of a business that might not be particularly agile, or trying to bring agile into new environments. One thing that Cower provides is a common communication framework, because it's metaphorical, and narratives are a useful metaphorical form to communicate quite complex ideas. Orson Scott Card said, a metaphor is I think he said something like the smallest amount of words to convey the most amount of meaning. That's the use of metaphor. So on the one hand, we're using this river metaphor to kind of understand flow and process and communicate that across different cultural paradigms. And then there's also the more kind of traditional storytelling aspect of narrative. And I mean, there've been a few articles written on this. There was one in Forbes published a couple of years ago, I think, about the hero quest, which just about every single entrepreneur buys into, because it's very much aligned with that sort of, go get them and search for things and go on a journey and gather an entourage and do good things and fight the monsters. It's all that kind of stuff. The hero quest fits really nicely with the agile approach. So we're using that hero narrative, that quest narrative, as the quest plot, as Christopher Booker calls it, aligning that with processes within agile, and then understanding, so who are the characters that are coming on this? What are the relationships between them, and what sort of environments are these taking place in? And environment is a really important factor in understanding this kind of process flow and understanding this concept in a narrative way, because we all function differently within different environments. In my mind, an agile environment should be quite dynamic and quite changeable and adaptable, to support that narrative, to support that kind of quest or hero plot. So those are two different ways that we're using narrative within the development work that we're doing. And interestingly as well, I mean, you mentioned Patrick Lencioni. I mean, he uses a fictional story to exemplify the 5 dysfunctions of a team. It's the most, everything's a story in my mind. In my world, everything's a story.
Yeah, I can really relate to that. And so what I'm wondering is, the Carolyn model is interesting because you're using the metaphor of a river. Have you used other types of, do you use like cartoons, for example, or how else would you get that narrative across? What have you tried, David?
Well, this is kind of, we're in that development process at the moment. The approach I tend to take with developing these ideas is a kind of, I suppose it's kind of similar to grounded theory, where you just amass information. You look at the perspectives of different people, the different perspectives that people have on that particular narrative, and get their feedback on that. Get their, how do they see that? How does someone else see that? Get all that information together and look for the points of connection, look for the correlations, and then from that, your story will emerge. So, I mean, this is something that you can apply to any team, because as long as you get the good amount of information, as long as you get a good saturation of information to then plot, where are connection points within that team? Where are the connection points, on that process that they're all sharing? Because teams kind of converge and diverge, don't they?
Yeah, can I just add there that it is a fascinating process, this. I've thoroughly enjoyed what I've learned from Dave as well. But it's really interesting how because it comes from an occupational therapy background, it takes into account the individual as well. And I mean, I'm focusing on a project that's entirely focused on teams, but the teams are made up of individuals, and you're an individual before you're a member of a team, and that's just the way it is. So actually, the fact that the metaphors that you use can answer those big questions, like what's in it for me. In the end, you've got to answer those questions. And that goes towards the empathy and the well-being, and it also helps to create trust if you can answer them.
Yeah, that's probably something I could probably do with your help on, because I've tried a few times to come up with a change story, but I'm not sure how compelling it was, because there's some you need to be a visionary to produce a vision, right? Or direction of travel, and can we really do that? How do we? I like where David is going about kind of capturing the energy from the people and trying to build up, let the story emerge.
I mean, a transformation is a rebirth plot. That's what I mean, I run from the 7 basic plots. A tragedy, comedy, quest, and so on. And the rebirth plot is one of transformation, where the character in a rebirth plot is, A Christmas Carol is a classic one. Where we have Scrooge, who has all these awful characteristics about him, but when he actually explores the reason for those, he goes through this transformation. Is actually able to, leverage the emotional pain that he's been through to, create that transformation. So I guess there you go, John. That's that's an answer.
Yeah, this kind of rings a bell, because I heard you the word hero is normally radioactive and agile, but what I have heard though is the hero's dilemma as a format for telling a story.
Yeah,
and, you're kind of building up the problems, kind of like Harry Potter in a sense.
Yeah,
isn't it? Kind of building up the story.
Yeah. But I mean, the thing is that these stories, these plot, I mean, they're full of archetypes, they're full of narratives that we've been, we were read these things as children, Watership Down and Stick of the Dump and Wind in the Willows, all of these stories that we might have been read as children. I'm showing my age there, aren't I? But they're embedded within us culturally. These are also cultural narratives. So when you start using these narrative processes, they resonate with people in a deeper way than perhaps just lining up a set of figures or giving a description of something. When we introduce these textures and dynamics, we recognize them at a very deep level.
And also, you did say, which I really liked, we were just discussing this yesterday, that because we were talking, John, about T-shaped, team members. It's really great if you can develop, as an individual, as to be T-shaped and your team is T-shaped. That helps with your alignment, of course, on your linkages. Fantastic. But what if, when we really look at HR, for example, traditionally, it's very structured. It's not particularly dynamic. And it struggles a little bit with being T-shaped sometimes. And Dave reminded me, and it was really helpful, because I was thinking, well, how do you overcome this? And if you're mainly sort of geared towards being structured, how are you going to change to become a little bit more dynamic and to enable other people to be dynamic? How are you going to do that? But I loved the answer, because, as Dave said, you use language that people can feel part of things. And HR, you need to use a language that helps HR understand their role in this, the same as anybody else playing a role. And I thought that was you gave some illustrations which were really helpful. There you are, I've used a metaphor. Evidently we use one every minute, so I'm told. And so that big picture only starts to emerge, I think, when you get into it. When you're just looking at it from the outside, you think, well, what's this got to do with me? Watership Down, it's nothing to do with me. I'm doing my job every day. I've got the kids screaming in the background, whatever it might be. And I've got a manager saying you haven't hit target, or you haven't made enough widgets, or whatever it is you've got to do. But actually, when you become part of something emotional that really touches you, and you realize this is my place in it, you understand what's in it for me, and how you can make every day work for you and be happier, then that all feeds into the well-being. You start to listen more, and they're affecting culture. So your story is starting to help you with that culture influence as well, cultural influence.
Go ahead. Sorry. I was reading. I'm reading John Cooper Clarke's autobiography at the moment, and he talks about reading Rupert the Bear books when he was a kid. I loved Rupert the Bear when I was a kid, and the fantastic thing about Rupert is that the story is laid out so that it's accessible to as many people as possible. First of all, you have the cartoon frames with a little line in there or a piece of dialogue, and then you have rhyming couplets underneath, which go into a little bit more detail in the story, and then you have prose underneath that if you want to read the story in greater depth. So, maybe we need a kind of maybe a Rupert the Bear approach, so that we have the HR version, and then the kind of the finance version, and then the agile version in depth under that. But it's just a thought that occurred to me as you're talking there, Carolyn.
It's funny, I actually got into trouble with a story like that recently. In Theory of Constraints, there's a character called Herbie, a little fat boy like me, not very fit. and got into trouble over it. But even though it's a story from the 1980s or something like that. So yeah, but, I'm sure we can find a way.
It's a story, surely.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, it was misunderstood. Let's put it that way.
But doesn't that shows you how deep stories can get with people? You know.
That's true. Yeah, it shows how powerful they are.
Yeah.
So I wanted to take a few comments, if you don't mind. When we come back from the comments, we might just, kind of get back to the question: how do we grow successful agile transformations with people working from home? I see a few long comments, so I'm going to just bring them up here. So one of them is from Matthew, who's a regular on the show. Thank you very much, Matthew. So, hi, Carolyn. I'm in the middle of a transformation initiative that's slightly overwhelming. I've got the conundrum of structure before culture, or culture before structure, are both parallel. What do leaders have to do when that narrative isn't believed? They've seen it before and they're untrusting of previous experiments. Carolyn, can you make a first attempt at that one?
Yeah, I can. I mean, first of all, hi, Matthew. I completely feel your pain. I think that we all know what you're up against there. And we've all been sitting in a room where we've seen people with folded arms who've been there before, seen it all, done it, got the T-shirt. And you're just thinking, oh, my goodness me, I'm just talking to myself here. But take heart, because I think a lot of what we've said today should give you the encouragement to know that people, as long as you make it accessible, people will listen. So try to find that which inspires them first, I would say, is a good answer. You might have a group of people whose well-being is absolutely fine, and they don't, they're higher up that pyramid. They don't need you to worry about that. They're probably feeling a great sense of belonging or whatever it might be. I'm not saying you have, but that could be the case. In which case, obviously, your approach is going to be different. You can get stuck in and start a bit higher up. In which case, you might be asking people, how do they feel they could change their environment to make it happier and make it more fun at work, and start asking them what they'd like to change. Ask people what they'd like to change and they'll tell you, and that's the start of your change.
I can top and tail that as well a little bit, Matthew. That's for me, it depends on the level of readiness of the executives for agility. As well, and we're all ready for agile, and we're naturally ready for it. But sometimes what happens is when we get promoted and become executives or whatever, new constraints are upon us, and we might have been previously very creative, and all of a sudden we find ourselves kind of constrained by the machine, so to speak, and what's kind of around us. And so what I notice is that if you have executives who believe that you can outsource your way out of any problem, you can scale your way out of any problem, those kind of executives are going to be less, I suppose, less welcoming of a structural change, because they'll think, better, faster, cheaper, let's make the sausages faster kind of thing. It's when there's a realization that having short-term initiatives where people move around quite frequently, we're all replaceable machine parts. When you move from that to realizing that we need longer-term stable teams and so on, that I think that's the kind of a level of consciousness that some executives need to reach before they realize that might be might lead to better outcomes. It also leads to more stress, because during that transition, there's a lot of stress around that period, and you need to be really serious then about changing the structure, and how do you do it, how wide do you go, and how deep do you go, and all that kind of stuff. So it's it kind of depends on the pocket of the organization you're in and how ready they are for this.
Yes, I think also, John, if I can add there as well, your structure, if you feel that the structure isn't right, then the thing is, I always believe you can't change culture. Culture changes, and it's organic, and all we can do is influence it, but we have to build trust to do that. And if there are a few things wrong, or you haven't got alignment, or you haven't got enterprise leadership that is visionary, or you haven't got the backing for the full transformation, and it's more sort of a, well, let's see how it goes, and if it actually cuts costs or makes us some money, and then if it's any good, we'll roll it out. You can't really get people to en masse to back something like that, because it's not a commitment. So I think by going to people and asking them what they would like to change, what would make them happy. It's a simple question. What would make you happy at work? I know it sounds really banal and so basic, but you'd be surprised how people will engage with you when you ask that question. And then when you ask them to be accountable by simply putting that on a sticky note, sticking it on a wall, suddenly they've put something in writing, they've stuck it on a wall. They're not going to change overnight, of course not. They're starting the process of realizing that what they say matters. And that is just so important for any successful transformation, I think. And probably, Kyle, you'll have some experience of that, sure. Sharp end.
Well, certainly, I know, I'm aware of many examples of companies, of businesses, where they've taken the step of prioritizing employee happiness above all else, actually, and going to a point where, you know, your salary increase isn't determined by anything but how much happier you make your workplace, how many kudos points you get during the year, or how many likes and things you accumulate, which seems almost bizarre that it's not going to be tied to any kind of productivity metric. But there are businesses that have made a success out of realizing that the happier we make the people that work for us, the more enriched they feel in their life and their work life, and the holistic nature of how those fit together, the more the business prospers, because happy people do great things, and they enjoy doing great things, which makes them happier, which means they do even greater things.
It's contagious.
Yeah, and to add to that as well, Kyle, we also probably need to give people space as well, where they have time to think. You know, can you imagine you're running from one Zoom call to the next?
Yeah.
You know, and how much time do you have to do what you're saying? You know what I mean? How have you managed that, actually?
So I think that for me is, you have to be able to sense space, to see space, and to have an awareness of it in a micro sense before you can really apply it actively in your work life. So it's one of the reasons I like to encourage mindfulness and meditation at work, and often that can make leadership roll their eyes, but the essence of meditation, what it's looking for, if you practice it, is to give you a space between when events happen and how you choose to react to them. It's developing that space in a very micro, very personal sense. And because it's in a very micro, very personal sense, you can do it in quite a safe way. You can do it offline from everyone else. And that kind of practice, I find in the course of my career, that leads me to a point where I can create as much space as I need in a work environment. So, and then as soon as you have that space, it's almost like time slows down, and you don't feel the meeting fatigue, and you don't feel the energy levels dropping, and everything just seems so much easier when you have that space.
You just reminded me of a quote from Woody Zool on Twitter yesterday, and he said, "When you don't have time to stop, you need to stop."
Yeah, there's a great Zen quote for that. Yeah, if you should take at least 20 minutes per day to meditate. If you find you don't have 20 minutes, you should take an hour.
I need to take a leaf out of that book, big time. Like even going for walks and stuff is kind of is a challenge.
Yeah, I certainly encourage my whole team to get out in the middle of the day, and I do it myself, and just take a walk and just get some fresh air, and yeah, don't become, because of the world we're currently living in isolation. Don't be trapped in a box all day long every day. It's not good for you.
I just realized as well yesterday that probably what I need to encourage is the kind of meeting where you don't need to be looking at a big screen, where literally you can go for a walk and you can be tuned in and engaged in the conversation without relying on visual aids, you know what I mean, to support the discussion.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, because I was just listening to that if you've ever been a bit naughty and driven too fast and you've been zapped by a camera and you have to go to the speed awareness class, they usually show that sorry, there's a spoiler alert coming up. They usually show that team that are passing the baseball back and forwards, and they ask you to concentrate on the video and count how many times the team passed the ball. So of course you're completely transfixed on this. And then at the end of it, they ask you how many times you passed the ball, and you think you're really clever because you counted it. And then they say, did anyone notice the gorilla walking through the room? And of course, what you've got there is cognitive overload, where you just are so concentrating on what you're doing. And the brain just cannot, it's all new to you, and you just don't see this. Obviously, it's a person in a gorilla suit. But I mean, this person's at least 4 inches taller than everybody else, walks through this room and you don't see it. Oh, and dances in the middle of the group of people and walks off the other side. Now, that to me says it all, that you need to go for that walk. You need to have that space, because you're not being innovative, by the way, of course, puts tremendous strain on our brains, because we are trying to think differently about things. So we are when we're tired, I think we're particularly likely to miss the opportunities, because our brains just can't cope with all those facts and all those opportunities, all those things that they need to consider in order to think outside the box. They're too busy watching people pass the ball, which is the day job. Yeah.
There's just to add to that, there's also something called situated cognition, which is a theory from phenomenological research where people stop thinking when we undertake day-to-day tasks. There's not a lot of cognition going on. We're pretty much on autopilot. So, and this comes back to environment as well. Like if we just run through the same routines every day, day after day, in the same environments, we get used to that routine and we stop reflecting and being mindful of what it is we're doing. So, that's another environmental thing. Changeable, adaptable, and stimulating environments really add to that performance aspect, and happiness and quality of being as well, meaningfulness.
Thank you, David. Got a few more comments coming in. So interesting talk from Matthew. Interesting talk about childhood cultural narratives. How do you tell a story to a globally structured team with a minority who may know, say, Scrooge, like, a massive organization? I actually know who Matthew's working with. I mean, the limitation of subculture is fascinating. As I'm writing, you just mentioned Rupert, and I think Matthew means he doesn't know who Rupert is. Maybe we're showing a race, David, I don't know.
Well, first of all, did you want me to respond to that, John?
Please, please.
Well, first of all, hi Matthew, and thank you for your comment. In terms of Rupert Bear was a cartoon character that was first appeared in the newspaper, the Daily Mail, I think, and he then had his own books, and he became a childhood kind of character that was part of my growing up, part of my formative years, and read to me as a bedtime story, and then later I read it myself, and it's now become a part of my interest in narratives. So it's a good question, because what we're talking about here is being culturally responsive, and just as Carolyn pointed out, that if you're trying to get two different cultures to communicate, then you have to find a language that both are responsive to. And I would say in the same way, we find narratives that are relevant to the organization that we're working with. Now, if you're looking at a globally distributed team, okay, I see the problem you've presented me with there. Then we look at global narratives. Narratives take place on many different scales. We have, intrapersonal narratives, the stories we tell ourselves that we never share with anyone. How our sort of metacognition, that's a story, that's a narrative in itself. Interpersonal, social, political, geographical, geological, cosmic, spiritual, these are all scales of narratives. So if you're working with a globally distributed team, then find narratives or work with narratives that are relative on that scale. So, at the moment we're all in this position with COVID. If I refer back to my 7 basic plots, thank Christopher Booker, that's an overcoming the monster story. such as Jaws or Beowulf.
Yeah,
You know,
I think it
yeah. So that these global narratives. I mean, I mentioned Christopher Booker a few times. He spent 25 years researching this book, and these are pan-cultural. These narratives, we understand them in all around the world. So find a narrative that resonates globally, and then work with your team on that scale. Is what I would say.
Thank you, David.
I've got something I could add to that as well, and it's just honestly, and I got the same experience with Rupert. It's very familiar to me as well. So showing my age as well, but the thing is, you can take a story like that and very similar, like especially children's stories. And I've done this over the last year. I've recorded myself reading children's stories, and I have shared those with people who don't speak English, as well as not being familiar with the stories, and had really positive responses. So it's been an experiment of mine in 2020. So what I would say, Matthew, is, your comment there is, I know, Rupert, but most people in a distributed team wouldn't. You know what? Read it to them. You know what? Sit down, build the narrative by reading them that children's story. It's so understandable. Those kids' stories, they're just made to be understood, and they resonate so quickly with people. And then you've got a shared culture that you've just built. I mean, what's stronger than that, right?
That's brilliant, isn't it? That makes me want to run out and do that now.
I get thrown out of the building outside. John's gone crazy. I'm joking. Might give it a go, actually. I'm going to come back to evidence in a minute if you don't mind, but there's a few more comments. So evidence about how we're doing well with agility in the remote world. But Samantha, I know Samantha, worked with her in Azerbaijan, and she's from Cape Town in South Africa. Thank you, Samantha, for commenting. I find that individuals that are struggling with coping with remote working are desperate to have someone to sympathize with their situation. In the last 2 days, I've had two total strangers totally open up about very personal narratives to me after 2 minutes of introduction. I think that by taking a unicorn empath stance, people just naturally feel safe over 10,000 miles of fiber connections on Zoom. That's really cool, Samantha, that you're able to kind of establish that level of humanity and empathy over a call like that. It's really cool. I'm just curious, Kyle, have you come across examples like that as well?
I think I'm in a virtual room with an example of that. Carolyn and I didn't know each other at all, and we got to know each other very well virtually, completely. And it's another experiment of mine for the last year is finding people I think sound interesting or might be saying interesting things, and just putting myself out there and saying, look, if I can be of service to you, I don't want anything. I just want to be of service to the world. And I think being willing to be vulnerable yourself goes a huge way towards establishing that trust with others that allows them then to open up. So, and I think Samantha must be on track for that kind of thing. Like she says, a unicorn empath stance.
Yeah, I need to look that up, Samantha. I don't know what that is, but it sounds really good. Got some more comments coming in. So Matthew,
could I just add to that, John? In the world of occupational therapy, we tend to say, rather than saying what's the matter with you, we say what matters to you. And I think that this is a need that we're actually meeting for one another. I mean, being here this evening is satisfying some of my needs to engage with other people on a common topic and share things with an audience. I have a massive ego, and I enjoy this kind of thing. But in terms of culture, in Cower, we define culture as spheres of shared experience placed in space and time. Now, at the moment, we're undergoing a global shift in terms of cultural identity. We are all sharing this experience. So through that experience, through that cultural kind of pathway, if you like, we're all being connected. It might be a horrible event, but that is one of the positives that's coming out of it. This is a global shared experience, and absolutely right. You should be there to listen and talk for people wherever they are, whoever they are. I'll get off my soapbox now. Sorry.
No, so I had contradictory training to that, which is creating problems for me. But I understand exactly what you mean, because I was trained by Marshall Goldsmith, and he says it's showtime. So as a change agent, I need to be smiling, need to be, everything needs to be good. Doesn't matter what's going on, everything's great. Because like if I'm supposed to be the change agent, then I'm kind of like, what kind of inspiration am I kind of? So it's like there's a conflict, but I do totally understand it, and I think I need to try what David, what you're saying, and what Kyle is saying. I need to give it a go.
Yeah,
It really works.
You can be real with people. You can be honest with people, and sometimes that's not going to be positive. But I think people respond better to honesty than they do to anything else.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to give it a go. It's like the pendulum. Is it one extreme or the other? Try and find some balance somewhere, maybe. So Samantha's come back. Fantastic comment on using meditation for creating time to think. Thank you, Samantha. The round belly, that must be me. That was a good name. How do you tackle greenfield transformations in a remote setting for large-scale portfolios? I can start with that one if you like. So I have that example at the moment. Well, I'm not sure it's a greenfield, but basically they started a new change completely remote. And one of the things that we did was with the fact that we were going to be remote. We weren't worried about open space and desk plans and all that kind of stuff. We were more worried about how do we synchronize, and how do we meet and how do we create space so people have time to think. Did it work out well? I'm not really sure. But one of the things that I make a big effort to do is to have one-to-ones with people. I find out what's really going on and take time out with them, even if it's an hour and a half or even 2 hours sometimes, just to see what's going on for them. And it might be nothing to do with the change. It might be some other nagging issues from legacy of the past, some previous change or whatever, that's now creating a kind of a hangover and maybe creating issues. So I found that a worthwhile investment, but the jury is still out. I'm curious, Carolyn, what would your answer be to this question? How do you tackle greenfield transformations in a remote setting? What have you tried?
Well, the problem that you get, first of all, I think, is that people have taken to technology differently. And that's one of the biggest problems that I think you have to get right and give people confidence with the technology. Absolutely critical, because it's going back to Maslow again. If people feel like they can't actually work the technology, they're not going to feel psychologically safe. They're not going to feel as though they're going to be heard. They're panicking. I've seen it many times. Even hosts who've been pushed into situations where they've been asked to host meetings and they haven't even had proper training on how to use things. And it's made them look rather sort of feel awkward. And if they feel awkward, then they're going to give the wrong vibe out, and everyone's going to be sort of feeling that this isn't working. And it just undermines the trust, I think, of the organisation when they put somebody in that position. And I was just doing one the other day with a group of people who, because as I say, I do quite a bit of work which is agile, which is HR for agile. So we're not actually talking about just software and so forth. Teams are, just who really understand how to use software and understand how to use technology and understand agile. We're talking about people who might be in an environment where they don't even have to use technology except what they're given at work to just manage the system to do their job. So you have to give the time, set the time aside to train them and listen to their problems until they are really confident in that. And I would say that they're really good at training each other. So find some mentors that can encourage them to use it, and then do some surveys to find out how people are feeling. Very difficult to get the honesty, I suppose, if you're asking people directly, oh, can you manage Zoom? Yes, I'm fine, because everyone thinks they're going to be sacked if they can't. So you need to be using some anonymous surveys to get some information back in. And as Kyle said, provide those safe spaces for people to communicate with you, get the technology right, and then then move on to other things that we've talked about in this event. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
I've got a great HR example for you, Carolyn. From we remotely onboard a software team, right? Software development manager. Like everyone I hire, computer science background, complete nerds, or so you would think. Last year, we remotely hired and onboarded a fashion designer. We decided we wanted a more inclusive set of viewpoints. We were creating a very visual product for a very new marketplace, and so we went looking for someone who could be a software tester for us, someone who could give us really good and really different feedback. And we grabbed someone who just done a fashion design degree, and she's become a successful part of the team. And a big part of it is exactly what you were saying. She came into a team where everyone was a tech head and everyone had all these tools and all these acronyms. And I mean, left to her own devices, she would have drowned. It would have been terrifying. So it was about being loving and being supportive and being, and making sure that there was always plenty of help on hand, and making sure that we had an environment within the team where it was really comfortable to be able to ask a question. There were no dumb questions, it doesn't matter what you say.
Yes, absolutely. Because even people who are really comfortable with tech, I think they're feeling a bit overwhelmed. I mean, I do. People say to me, "Oh, you're using." Sometimes I find myself in a conversation with people, and we're actually having one conversation over 3 different channels. It's coming in on text, WhatsApps. It's sort of like coming over messaging services. Somebody decides, "Oh, I was just using Facebook, so I put it in Messenger." It's like, "Oh, right, okay. Well, I didn't even know where that flashed up on the phone, but I can't even find it now." So yeah, it can be very confusing.
It just reminded me, I'm working with some apprentice coaches, so people basically learning stuff off me, shadowing and so on. But one of the things I probably need to help them with is not just agility and the human factors, but also remote facilitation skills. How do you run these events with lots of people? We don't want people getting bored with the same old tools and the same old formats. How do we really engage people, and how do you really light up the whole room? And so I've been delighted with liberating structures, which I've been able to do online, and some other fascinating techniques. I'm curious, David and Kyle, have you discovered any nice tools, not so much technology tools, but like ways of facilitating in the last 12 months?
Shall
I can be really quick. So I can just say I've been using liberating structures for a while now. They're so good. And the one thing I found that was great, because people were getting more fatigued, there's a liberating structure. I don't know if you know it, 1, 2 for all, a great liberating structure for facilitating meetings. But people were getting so fatigued that what I did was I ran a asynchronous 1, 2 for all. So it was very offline and it was very stretched out. So you were on your own, then you were in a pair, then you were in a quad, then we all came back together. And the last meeting when we all came back together was the final live meeting. And it really helped people breathe through that process.
Cool. David, what about you? Have you come across anything?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of technology, there's a platform that I'm just starting to wrap my head around called eCam, which is specifically for Mac users, and it's basically a virtual studio. You set up scenes, you can have multiple cameras, you can create scene shifts within it and picture in picture and all these. It's a very creative suite, and possibly not for the faint-hearted, but it's a great way of putting something that quite slick together that has enough movement to
that's quite
keep
good.
people engaged.
That's quite good if you do come across your stories as well, isn't it? If you're developing your narratives, you could use something like that. I mean, I know you send me videos sometimes from that. And it's excellent. It really makes my day. I get them. They're fun and they draw me in. So you're not just relying on sort of the spoken word. You can actually use media for this too.
No. Well, I mean, if you're in a theatre, you have scene and lighting and costume and makeup and all that sort of thing. The scene, the setting, the framing, all of that is part of the story. But in terms of physical delivery, I think what we should really remember is that, you know, you guys are not inside my computer. You're not three tiny people inside my screen. You're real physical people in a physical space. And I'd like to see more sort of stand up, moving around and using the space that we're in. And again, sharing that experience.
Definitely
you know?
agree.
I'd like to see more kind of, if I reach through that way, could Carolyn sort of shake my hand and could I pass a banana down through the screen? And, you know, one thing I used to do was I'd draw moustaches on everyone in a Zoom meeting. Draw little curly moustaches on them and see if I could match them up with the movement. So I think there's loads of stuff that we can do with virtual environments, but remember that the virtual environment exists within a physical one, and set up an interplay between the two.
That sounds really cool.
So that's augmenting the virtual world with the real one, not the other way around.
So I'm going to talk about every question. We're going to wrap this up very soon. But so if you got any comments or questions online, please, now is a good time to get your final questions in. So this one, Carolyn, I find that some clients have 4 or 5 different comms tools, and it's absolutely overwhelming and irritatingly distracting. I think having just team communication agreements or company-wide comms agreements is critical. Any reaction to that, Carolyn?
Oh, yes, I think that's absolutely right, Samantha. You know, bring some sanity to proceedings, please, because we've got enough to deal with, I think. So, yes, this is where you can find structure really useful, obviously. You know, we need structure as well as dynamic activity. Agility is very dynamic, of course, but we do need to have a structure that we can all rely on.
Yeah, otherwise it's just going to be chaos, right?
It's just going to be chaos.
Yeah. Ron Belly, I'm also creating an environment trusting happy hours and all. Well done, Ron Belly. Yeah, keep that going. Andrei has a question from Ukraine. What to do with people who just refuse to turn video on?
That's just so, I mean, I love that one. This makes me think of my work as an employment lawyer, which I, do very little of these days because I'm beguiled by agile and narratives and all these wonderful things that Kyle and Dave have been talking about, and yourself, John, and all the conversations we have. But, going back to that, that's no different to saying, I mean, I can remember, this is honestly true, few years ago when I was, well, it's quite a long time ago, I can remember a client phoning and saying, I've got a problem. I've got a member of my staff who will only come to work on a skateboard, and therefore they're always late. And they say that I'm discriminating against them if I don't allow them to come to work on a skateboard because they can't afford a car. Now, this is where we're starting to go into what I call bonkers territory, and we have to just say, look, I'm sorry, but we've got to do what we can do reasonably. What would the reasonable person do in this situation? Because we represent a lot of people here in this organisation, and to introduce that particular exception to our rule would cause chaos, and we can't have that. And it would also, I think, in this example, Andre, it would really undermine, I don't know how you feel about this, but it really undermines my psychological safety. I feel very uncomfortable when I'm speaking to a group of people, some of whom do not turn on the camera. I find that very, very strange. And I can't give my best when that's happening. So maybe that's a very good reason to introduce a policy whereby people who are working from home and have jobs which require them to collaborate with others are required to dress as though they're going to the office, or you could be casual about it, but they will need to do what they would do in a normal environment, and that is actually be seen.
Yeah. Kyle, what have you tried?
I think it's really important to stop if you can and understand what it is that they're objecting to and turning their video on. It's so important that we see people first, and that we see them as human beings and not as objects, and that means that there's often something going on under the surface for them, and sometimes taking the time to build a relationship with them to a point where they're willing to open up and explain just what their fears are and what their insecurities are it can change your own way of looking at the whole thing as well. And in the end, you might find everyone ends up on video, and occasionally when people can't handle being on video, you might find everyone else on the call is actually a whole lot safer with it because of that relationship building.
Yeah, can I just say there as well that what I was saying was, please don't, I would advise against creating an exception to a rule for one person. So the best thing to do is to create your structured, if you feel that this is important to be part of your structure. You might not, as you've just said, Carl, but if you did, then you say to the person, let's deal with this separately, as you rightly say, because this might be something very personal to them. But what I wouldn't do is create a workaround, a hack where it's okay for people not to do something like that, because it will spread quite quickly. And I think it creates quite a bit of friction between workers and employees and staff if they feel that some people could just take a view which is to some extent antisocial, because it does have an impact.
Yeah, it's avoiding conflict rather than managing it successfully.
Quite right, yeah.
Yeah, it kind of depends as well on the situation. So if I turn up to a meeting, I'll come back to you in a sec there, David, and if I come up to a meeting and let's say I don't really have that much influence, all I can do is just turn my camera on and turn my mic on, and what I notice is people start copying me then, but then if as soon as someone presents, they turn the cameras off again, which is kind of annoying. But if I have more influence, like if I'm the trainer in a training course, what I'd say to them is cameras on, mics on, they're the rules, because I want you to be able to interject as quickly as possible. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, a similar comment to that, really, John. I was just thinking to myself, well, I suppose the first question is does it matter? And it depends on what you do. If you're at some, networking event where there are umpteen people, and it may not really matter that your video's off. But as you say, so, I mean, if I was sat here now with my video off, that would be really rude. I would expect to be booted off quite quickly. So I guess the more intimate the situation, the more direct it is, then the more reason there is to have your video on. But I like the idea of just building.
Sorry, Dave, you go ahead. Sorry, you go ahead.
I like the idea as well as just of building a relationship with people. I was on a call just the other day talking to a group of holistic therapists, and someone had their video off, but it was a picture of them. And I said, are they sitting that still? Is that, is their screen frozen? And apparently she was listening to what I was talking about exactly while she was making some jewelry. So we got quite engrossed with a little conversation about her jewelry making, but it was a fairly informal event, so it was entirely appropriate, and she had a reason. So I guess explore first before you start drawing hard and fast conclusions.
I would say though, to Andre as well, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's just been a report out that says that it can be, we're getting quite depressed and getting quite concerned about our body image and all the rest of it, because we're staring at these screens all the time. And I know I'm for one, I'm thinking to myself, gosh, what do I look like? And I often see people coming on and they're just sort of using the,
Carolyn, don't worry, you look fabulous.
Oh, thank you so much. But you do, and you start criticizing yourself. I mean, how often can you ever remember a time when you've stood and looked in a mirror for maybe 3 or 4 hours a day? No, of course not. So you're absolutely right. You do need to be very sort of sensitive to that. But I think as a main rule, I think it is better if you can have people.
Weirdly enough, I put some aftershave on before the call. So, I mean, what does that mean?
I thought I could smell that.
I know, why not?
Could you just pass that down through your screen to?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, here it comes. There we go.
Did Andre actually? Did he add something, John, to say that he had taken a particular approach?
I don't know.
No, he's gone now.
Oh, it's gone now. It was a comment. Yeah. It was a comment on the screen. I thought he might have said that he'd got a solution to it, but I was just intrigued to know what that was, but I missed it.
Oh, I don't see it. Yeah, okay. I'll keep an eye out for that later. Samantha's come back, and she tends to disagree with the camera stance. if you feel you don't want
Yeah,
to be
well,
on camera, that's okay. Yeah, go ahead, David.
well, I think she's right there. I mean, explore. If I mean, discreetly, you might just send a personal message to someone and say, I notice your camera's off. Is everything okay? Is there a reason why it's off? And I think if you're hosting a meeting, you have every right to know why or why not a camera is off. Or, it could be a technical problem. There's a whole load of reasons why. But be sensitive in the first instance, and then become progressively less sensitive, I suppose.
I got the impression that Andre was saying that this person refuses, perhaps I misunderstood, this refuses to turn it on a regular basis. I mean, ever.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, who just refused to turn
there we go.
Yeah. I mean, it's different to having an off day.
I confess, though, to having a bias because I'm a trainer as well, right? And there was one course, I'm not joking you, there was a lady, she was on the class, she connected, but I found out afterwards she wasn't even there. I was like, so it's like I'm traumatized by that, It's like, come on. So no, maybe I'm too much, maybe I need to go back the other way.
But my top tip is just become really good at listening to the sound of your own voice, and you'll find you entertain yourself so much that you won't mind if actually no one turned up.
So I have to ask something really important of Carolyn about measurement, right? So the exam question here is, how do we roll out successful agility transformations with people working from home? And I know, Carolyn, you're doing a lot of work in the area of measurement at the moment. Can you just tell us a little bit about that and what you've been focusing on to try and see are people actually coping well with agility and so on?
Yes, well, thanks, John. As I said earlier, I'm involved with looking across the business, not just at software teams who are used to working with agile as part of what they do, or even teams who are dedicated to agility, but to try to understand across the organization whether or not people who are working from home and are remote. I mean, imagine you're remote working and suddenly someone says, we're going to start agile working. You don't know what it means, even if they change the language and try to say, well, it's actually about collaboration. It's okay. It's about collaboration, inclusion. And then you sort of start explaining some of the sprint language and all the rest of it, which is also a bit overwhelming if you've never heard of it before. But wouldn't it be better to start off knowing whether or not the team that you're putting together, you might have chosen a cross-functional team to work on a particular project, whether or not they work well together in an agile way? This way you can keep an eye on inclusivity, for example, make sure that people are given the space to be included, that even the most introverted junior member of the team is heard. And that's really important. And that's one of the advantages, of course, of agile working, that it's a safe space to speak out. So a system called Shine, which measures collective team agility, and it's designed to allow you to carry on working on a project on an online whiteboard, and we collect data to see whether or not that team is actually suited to working together, or whether there might be in an agile way, or whether or not there might need to be some intervention, or whether they're so good at it that they could become mentors for others.
Yeah, thank you very much. And so this Shine, it sounds really, really interesting. I'd love to find out more about it. So essentially, from what you're kind of saying, I think it's about measuring the collaboration energy of the teams and teams of teams. Is that kind of where you're going with this? Is that what Shine is trying to achieve?
Yes, it is. Yes, I mean, it's a collaboration vibe, if you like. That's another way of putting it. I like that, John. I might take that and use it. Don't be surprised to see it again in very soon on the website.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that sounds really, really good. So, like, measurement is a big area for me, right? And the last thing I just throw out there, and we don't have to talk about it this evening, but something that I'm struggling with at the moment is how do people get promoted in this agile world? And that's something I'll probably be talking to P. Maria Thorne about maybe in a couple of weeks' time as well, 3 weeks' time. But also curious about the discussion. So essentially, it's Craig Larman's idea that you'd have this additional path where you get, you get promoted by the number of skills that you've acquired, materially different skills, and the number of skills you can coach other people on, but also how you're showing up. That would be my additional riff to that. How you're showing up, what your level of consciousness, what kind of values, behaviors are you demonstrating? So you could be like cross-functional. You could have lots of skills, but maybe you're not really turning up in a nice way as a team player or something like that, or you're maybe stuck in your old ways, and maybe that's holding us all back. Have you any kind of brief comments on that in terms of what you think the future is going to be in the agile world? I'd like to hear this from each of Kyle, David, and Carolyn. Any thoughts on how we're going to deal with this challenge in the coming years? Kyle, we start with you, maybe.
Well, I don't know if I have any thoughts off the top of my head on that. Challenges for the future. I mean, I'm so used to seeing things from a software business perspective, and I see far more opportunities than I see challenges. And I think I never see technology as a barrier, because my experience is showing me that it's the way technology is delivered and the way people are introduced to it that's the barrier. So if we're prepared to work on those people barriers, and again, coming back to the importance of people being at the forefront of everything we do, technology doesn't hold people back. Then it becomes a really, really good thing. And I think things like Shine that are trying to help call out and highlight ways that we can become more energized as teams, the ways that we can get more collaborative and get more out of that those sort of things are going to help nudge us towards a better future.
Yeah, I could tie into that as well. I think if we kind of focus more on measuring the how rather than the what, I think it's the way we work with each other.
Yeah.
And more tools like Shine would probably help with that. David, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, coming from my own sort of area, my mind's just gone blank. Do you ever have those moments where it just all goes? So you go, oh my god! No, come back. Yeah. So just thinking narratively, thinking in terms of, how do we measure that and promote that and understand that? I think when we start getting multiple narratives all interacting with one another, what starts emerging then is game. What starts emerging then is gameplay, because you're getting two-way activity going on. So maybe looking at all those different promotion aspects that you described there, John, which are consciousness. So can we promote people on the basis of consciousness? If you're a Buddhist monk, you're going to kind of rise up the echelons rapidly. So how do we measure and facilitate and reward those things? Very difficult in traditional frameworks, but when we start understanding things in narrative terms, in more fluid terms, and in those kind of, I say game, I don't mean that as a sort of playing games with one another, I mean interactive narratives. Maybe that's the way forward to answer that question, to fulfill that.
I can't hear you very well, John. Sorry.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay? Because I can answer. I can add a little bit to that question too. I think if we're going to beat the robots, we're going to have to listen to people. We're going to have immersive learning. John Hagel's scalable learning is very attractive to me, and I think that your description or your theory of reward in those circumstances is attractive. I think it really could be a great fit. I sort of imagine that there has to be a way to make people, there's always the what's in it for me, there's always that, and naturally, and we should respect that as well. So I think if we are going to beat the robots, we can get the robots doing all the stuff we don't want to do, all the stuff that we need doing really, really fast, and people can work together for immersive learning reasons, and they can teach each other things with the guidance of people who perhaps have been doing work for a very long time or doing jobs in a particular way, and then you'll spark innovation, and people will be encouraged to think differently. These T-shaped teams, because you're getting lots of different experience in the mix, lots of different skills in the mix, and you're encouraging the right behaviours. So this is all, I think, all going in the right direction. I'm a fan of that.
Thank you, Carolyn, and I want to thank you, David and Carolyn, for joining this evening and having this discussion. Also, Kyle, who just had to leave there for another session. Thank you, the three of you, for this, and thank you as well, everyone, for your wonderful comments, engagements, and keep an eye out for a podcast episode on this topic as well. Okay.
Thank you, John. It's been really great. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Been a pleasure, John. Thank you.
My pleasure's all mine. Thank you.